Dave, how you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. I'm excited to talk with you, Ryan.
Did you always want to be a writer when you were in the Marines?
I did. I did. So in high school, I got something. I got national recognition for a short story, like when I was in 10th grade. And all it meant was, if you remember National Scholastic Magazine, I don't like if they had that when you were like a kid, was I had my name on a piece of paper. Again, but this magazine was nationwide. And so it was like, cool, that was really cool. And then like that summer, I got something from the Philadelphia College of Art or Philadelphia School of Art, which was ludicrous because I'm like, why is a college that I'm a junior coming into my junior year? It was like 1985 or something. I'm like, why is this happening? Like, I'm not going to School of Art. And so then, but like I was encouraged, I guess, more writing. And I really liked writing. And so like I started writing poetry. And I got some poetry that like won contests or whatever. And then like it came time to go to college, and it was one, grades weren't good enough because I wasn't focused. So no scholarship that way. I either had to work or go ROTC. And like I had this love-hate relationship with the Marine Corps because my dad was in it, and I hated moving because it was always like starting over and like scabbing, like, okay, we're never gonna be friends again, bye. And like you move somewhere else, and you're just like, oh. So I wasn't gonna do Marines. So I was gonna do Navy ROTC. Well, that was like too technical because my mind's not engineering. And so like I panicked. So like, oh, I can't do this. So like worked really hard to get into Marines, also worked on but I was an English major in college. And so like that's what I loved doing. And I was focused on writing, but at the same time I knew as soon as I graduate, I'm going to be in the Marines, and Marines don't write. Marines don't write poetry, so that's not going to happen. And so I had this sort of forecast in my head that I'm going to graduate with an English major, but that's going to be the last thing I use. Like my college roommate was a psychology major, and he's going in the Marines too. And I'm like, what's that going to do for you? It's going to really help you. Like same thing. Like it was almost like we both felt like we'd sort of thrown away our majors because we didn't know how they were going to apply to our lives. But yeah, when I got into the Marines, it was like, I'm going to learn how to be a Marine and lead. And I absolutely subdued that writing bug.
Yeah, it's interesting because you mentioned, and the first thing you said that one of the most impactful moments of realization was understanding that you wanted to, or you found your purpose.
Yep.
You found your purpose in life, and I'm curious because going into the Marines is a pretty big decision,
Sure.
as well as choosing your major in college because it kind of provides you that direction. Did either of those choices align with any sort of purpose you may have thought you had before you made those choices?
It's a great question. And I really hadn't thought about it that way. But I think for me, what I've come to realize is, and this is going to sound, I'm not saying this is in, like endorse, like trying to get sympathy, but like I grew up, even as a kid, I now realize I was born to be a Marine because we moved around all the time. And that's the Marine lifestyle. We lived in Japan for 3 years as a kid. You don't want to tell me in 1979, 1980, going to, the Eastern philosophy and being exposed to that for 3 years in your formative years doesn't have an effect on you. That's why I teach yoga. That's why like all this stuff, like that's such a big part of why my life has happened the way it has, is because this exposure to Eastern philosophy had me meditating at an early age. To answer your question, like I had no idea what I would do if I didn't join the military, like as a kid. I had no clue because it wasn't because like there's this sort of transitory, like my life was, I'm here for this long, and that's how I lived because you knew, okay, we're going to be here from this year, and then we're going to leave this year, and so you kind of built your life. At least I did in that sort of box. And then when it came time to like, what are you going to do? I was like ROTC was the only thing that made sense because it was like that's the only thing I knew was like there were 4 different services, Army, Air Force, Navy, Marines. I didn't want to do the Coast Guard because I didn't know a lot about the Coast Guard, but like Navy Marines, I'm familiar with that, so that's the path I'm going to go. And I had no compunction about doing anything else.
Yeah, I talked to my wife about this before we had kids. We had, you go through and you say, well, how do we want to raise our kids? And one of the things we brought up was we just said we want to expose them to so many different things that they were comfortable with all the options that they would have in life. And we didn't want to like pigeonhole them into saying, these are our interests. This is what we love to do. So you guys are going to have to feel like you have to do the same thing. And in so many ways, I think exposing people to a variety of activities, a variety of topics, a variety of people, I think it's so important because, like you said, if you are pigeonholed into just these collective experiences, then you might not understand all the options that are out there.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to hear you say, well, I mean, if I didn't become a Marine, I don't know what I would have done. It's the same way. Yeah. It's the same way growing up. Like I grew up in a suburban area of Rochester, New York. And I didn't know what career options there were either. It never occurred to me actually to go into the military because I didn't really know many military people. I knew you could be a doctor, a lawyer, a teacher. It was like, okay, well, those are three jobs that normal, like, people might have based on what my guidance counselor is telling me, and then you kind of move around and you say, oh my gosh, I didn't know any of these careers ever existed.
Oh, well, it was like so cool because even going through graduation, like it was weird. I joined a fraternity because my brother, like I followed my brother to Penn State because that's where he went. And the fraternity was like Animal House. I mean, it was just a dingy looking fraternity. Like people would cross the street to avoid walking in front of this fraternity, which is ironic because when I joined in the 80s, it was like 80% ROTC people. And then I think by the time I left, it was like down to 40% or something. And it kind of eventually ROTC, I think, went away from it. But it was like, that was it. Like, that's what was going to happen. And there was nothing else. But then like my friends be like, oh, well, I might get a job with Disney doing like Pixar animation kind of stuff. And you're like, dude, and part of it's like, of course, because you're artistic and you've got this skill, that's so cool. And then it's like, oh, I want to do something like that. And you're like, oh yeah, but I'm gonna go get my head shaved and go do what my dad did because it's hard to like break yourself out of that world if you've never really seen what's on the other side of it. So yeah, it was pretty funny looking back on it.
Yeah, and people would probably look at your experience and say, dude, you're going into the Marines? That's so cool. You get to shave your head and go shoot guns. And, it's like, it's just through the lens of the beholder, I guess, is this perspective. And you had a bunch of experiences that a lot of other people didn't have growing up that people would look at and say, oh my gosh, you lived in Japan for 3 years? Like, what was that like? First of all, what was that like? What was it like growing up and having 3 years spent as a child in Japan?
Yeah, no, it's interesting because my dad fought in the Vietnam War and he fought like he was a trigger puller, came back with those experiences. I came along 2 years after that, and he did one unassigned. Like sometimes there's unaccompanied tours, and so my dad, he was in the Marines for 31 years, but he went to 1 year by himself to Japan, and our family stayed, I think, in Colorado with family there. And then a couple years later, like we were going through school, and he's like, "Well, let's take the whole family to Japan." And so it was this like introduction, and we would go visit battles because it was on Okinawa, Japan. And so you could go see like stuff where the Marines fought in World War II, but then we'd also go to these temples and you just see like the elegance and the eloquence of Japanese culture in full display. And they'd have like these beautiful festivals, the Obon Festival, which is like this festival, like commemorating and celebrating like their ancestors. And these drums would beat at night, and you're just like, and you're the minority and you don't really understand what it means to be a minority, but you're like, no one looks like me on the other side of this fence that we live on. Like no one, like everyone's got black hair. And then at some point the Japanese teenagers started to get like dyeing their hair, coloring it like different colors and stuff. But like, so then you come back to the US where 99.5% of kids your age have not had that exposure. And they're sort of all in tune with the culture of the cadence of growing up. Well, Like I had soccer and stuff in Japan, but it was in Japan. Like we had one US TV channel and that was it. And then we had like a Japanese channel that played like really cool cartoons. And like as a kid, you would watch that. But your prism into the rest of the world is like, I remember I became a fan of General Hospital because that was the only thing on when I got home from school. Like I knew about Luke and Laura and the Quartermains as a 10 or 11-year-old because that was on at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when we got home from school. And my friends, like my best friend and I, were tired of watching Star Wars because we memorized the entire thing. So coming back to the US, it's like you realize it's like, oh my gosh, like people have a different focus. There's the competition of popularity that high school, certainly in the 80s was there. And so you're trying to navigate these waters, but there's also kind of this stillness. Like I tell people, I started meditating when I was like 13 or 14 years old. Like I remember because I was fascinated by Japanese culture, by Buddhism, and like the simplicity of beauty when you kind of really come down to it. And so like I had like a little Japanese sword, like this cheap metal sword, but I would put that in front of me and like concentrate on it. And I read this book on Shambhala, this mystical kingdom. And it was like, here's how you like stop thinking. Like that's the whole thing. Don't think. And then after a few moments of like this sort of eternal silence, then a thought will pop into your head and boom, look, you had a thought. And like, I'm not sure what I'm doing because I'm 13, but all my friends are out partying and I'm trying to learn how to meditate. And so, but like, and that, it was weird because it was this weird contrast with what like was popular. And so like I was trying to fit in, but at the same time I had this exposure, and then it just sort of blossomed. And even in my military career, like I got selected to advanced schools because I wrote poetry. Like I started writing about 10 years into my military career because I had a boss who painted. But like that's kind of the military dependent / veteran experience. Is you move around, you get exposed to things that so few people get exposed to. It's not like living in Okinawa, Japan was the Sandals Resort in Jamaica. Like that's not like we would go out, like my friends and I would go off base, and you're in Japan, like you're in Okinawa, and nobody speaks English, and you're seeing all this different stuff. And like we found shops that like we could play video games with, and sometimes we'd play with Japanese kids, and you're having these bonding moments, but you don't realize the significance of what you're doing because you're a kid. At the same time you're processing this, and this is like my experience. And certainly like the Buddhism and that Eastern philosophy absolutely stayed with me, both in terms of how I developed militarily, but also how I developed kind of holistically and spiritually.
Yeah, it seems as though the spiritual aspect of the Buddhism, of your experience in Japan, truly has stayed with you and has kind of like almost guided you through life. And correct me if I'm misinterpreting any of this as I go. But it seems like it was something that really did have a profound impact on you, especially since you've continued to do it. You continue to teach yoga.
Yeah.
You wrote a book called Whiskey and Yoga,
Right.
and you have carried this with you throughout life. What did you realize how big of an impact it was having when you started meditating and you started really delving into the spirituality in Japan? Or was it just kind of something that was maybe passing time as you were there?
Yeah, so it wasn't even that direct. Like I don't think I started doing it in Japan because like Japan was like almost kind of this heaven for me, because it was like I had my best friend there. We loved the same stuff. We loved comic books. We loved Star Wars. They had like Japan in the 1970s and early 1980s, like their toys were incredible. Like the intricacy and like the stuff that you could do with these toys was just amazing. So like as kids, it was like you have plastic figures in the US that are bulk produced. Here in Japan, because they focus on beauty and like trying to make perfection, like they had these little toys that were just incredible. So like it was just this heaven. And then you go back to the US and it's like everybody's kind of the same flavor of like, this is what I'm doing to be popular, whatever the case may be. And so it's like, and it's hard to reconcile that. And then I think at some point it just becomes, well, yeah, this is who I am. Like, okay, but how do I do this? And for me, it wasn't like there was something, I don't know what it was, but there was this something that I couldn't fully articulate as a teenager. I just knew it was my version of teen angst. It was, I want to be like everybody else, but I know I am not. Like, I know there's this thing that like makes me look at Frankenstein and I like fall in love with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or Tarzan. Like, I was enamored kind of with Tarzan as a kid and the Edgar Rice Burroughs books. And then it just kind of like continues to blossom, but like I don't like it really didn't come into focus for me probably for the last 4 or 5 years. And it's because it was in some cases it was trying to do bigger versions of the same thing, thinking that bigger was gonna like turn the tide, like relationships and stuff. And then it was, and certainly we haven't even talked about it, but growing up in a Judeo-Christian philosophy and then having that mix, honestly, in a lot of ways, the military helped me kind of bring that together because I went to a year school, an advanced degree school where we studied like the theory of warfare. And there's the theory of like, there's sort of a Western theory of war, which is Clausewitz, this Prussian commander who fought Napoleon. And then there's an Eastern theory of war, which is Sun Tzu, The Art of War, which was written about 2,500 years ago. But like, they're both coming to the same place, the same conclusions. It's just one does it very artfully and one does it very pragmatically. And you see that like play out in, people think, well, I can't be a Christian and believe in Buddhism. Well, why not? Because they're all part of the same reality you live in. Like, you just have to understand how they interrelate to one another. And that was like the big kind of, even with the law of attraction, really, that was kind of the big revelation, was there's this blending of philosophies and you have to realize that the blend is like the oneness of being kind of thing.
I'm not too familiar with Buddhism in terms of the writings. So, what is it that is so similar? So, because that's an interesting comment. I would imagine people who, similar to what you said, are dogmatically entrenched in the Judeo-Christian religions. I would imagine most of them, like you said, don't believe you can have Buddhism and Judeo-Christian religion kind of like
Sure.
match up. I mean, what is it about the two of them that does?
Well, I think what you have to realize is when we look at, like, if you follow the traditional Christian story, God creates the universe in 7 days, and then Adam and Eve, and this kind of flow. And so you get to, like, the Old Testament is this angry rhetoric, and there's some poetry in there, like there's some stories about David and the Psalm. Like, I think the Psalms are there. I don't know if they're in the New Testament or not, but like there's stuff in there, but it's an angry God. And basically his message to the Jewish people is, I'm the only person you can follow. Like, I'm the only God, so nobody else. And then there's this weird transition where the New Testament starts and Jesus is born and it's foretold and all this stuff. And then he comes out and says, well, I'm the Son of God. And so the Jewish people are like, okay, for generations, we've been said there's only one God, no one else. And now this person comes out and says, well, I'm his son. So what are you gonna do? And so it's this clash. And then there's his temptations, his miracles, and crucifixion, resurrection. And in the West, we view this as all, like, we view it like it's not for sure that Jesus is going to and be resurrected in a way. Like, it's oh my gosh, this horrible drama is playing out. But if God is this perfect being in creation, then, and created everything, then God's responsible for hell. So there's got to be a connection, and heaven and hell, that's just kind of a oneness. It's yin and yang, just in a different language. And when you kind of get to that place and you realize, okay, the message is really like, that's how much you have to believe, is to get to the point, realize that there's like this universal oneness, and it's not this game about, God, I hope at the end of time that, God and Jesus get 51% of the vote and the devil only gets 49% of the vote. And so that, like, it's better in heaven than it is in hell. Like, it doesn't make sense. So I think that like the universal oneness, you just have to sort of apply that philosophy to the Judeo-Christian landscape, and you come to a much different place.
That's an interesting perspective, and I would imagine that that's pretty consistent with a lot of what people think. What would you say? How do you think spirituality and just your thoughtfulness along the lines of spirituality and yoga, how do you think that helped you be successful, or did it help you be successful as a Marine?
Um, I think it helped a little bit. I think like it was weird because the Marine Corps is all I knew, but I hated being in the Marine Corps. Like, and so even though like, and my first few years were amazing because like I was in, you're doing training. So you're doing a lot of live firing stuff. You're dropping out of helicopters. You're getting exposed to tanks. Like, I mean, you're doing insane stuff. And then you go into the operating force. And for me, like I joined a unit that was just 1 month into a 6 month preparation to go be on the Pacific Ocean for 6 months is kind of like a neighborhood watch for the world. And so again, insane amounts of training. I'm in artillery, so we're blowing up stuff like all the time. I'm like dropping out of hell holes in helicopters like at night, like on a rope, and like you're doing all this insanely cool stuff. And then you go on a ship, and you're on a ship for like 6 months, and you hit Hawaii, you hit Singapore. You're seeing different cultures, but you're also seeing like what it's like to be in the ocean. And like you're not you're not in the Navy, so you're not steering the ship or worrying about keeping the ship up. Like, so you're on like, there's only so many classes you can do to talk about artillery. And when you're like stuck together 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it's 3 weeks between like Hawaii and Singapore, you're just like, okay, well, here we are, let's play cards. And so, but then you also like you see sunrises and you see sunsets, and you're like, this ocean is huge. Like this thing is mammoth. And it just goes on. And then you go, instead of going to Australia, because that was like the dream, we all want to go to Australia. It's like, no, you're actually going to go do real world stuff. And you're going to go to Somalia, and you're going to start, like, you're going to land, like one of our first amphibious landings since like Korea in the 1950s. You're going to land on what we were told was like an opposing landing, like a beach. And so like the detail was, we heard there were going to be 1,000 armed Somalis at the beach. Well, the weird thing was, like so you get like super serious, and there's like, okay, what's going to do? You come up with a plan. You're in on the plan. Even like as a young officer, I'm involved in the plan for the team that I have responsibility for. And then like it's the day that you're getting ready to launch, and so like it's the day before really, because we get the final stuff. 1,000 armed Somalis. You can't shoot at someone unless they point a weapon at you. That was our rules of engagement. And so like we had a company of Marines, about 150 Marines that were going to come ashore on amphibious tractors in the water. We had another 150 that were going to come ashore on rubber boats. And then we had like another 150 or so that were going to come ashore with helicopters. And so that was the plan to start Operation Restore Hope in the early 90s. And so, but artillery, because it's big guns, and that's like somewhere stuck in the ship that you got to get it out, takes like 4 days or so to get ashore. So they say, okay, well, Lieutenant Richards, you're going to be a platoon commander and a rifle guy. So you're going to take charge of these 17 Marines. You're going to go set up a roadblock outside. So you're doing all this stuff. So Somalia was this amazing adventure. And then it's like, this is awesome. And then you get back from Somalia, and all the money goes somewhere else because other units are doing stuff. And you're like, okay, now this is what Marine life really kind of is. It's a lot of doing stuff, cleaning stuff, occasionally doing training. And then it just becomes monotonous. But what isn't monotonous is the pain of moving every 2 or 3 years. And I finally got to a point in my career where I'm like, I'm doing this to myself. Like the Marine Corps isn't saying you have to stay in. And so like, why am I going to do this if I hate the fact that like I can't just be in one place and see what that side of life is like? Why can't I just stay somewhere for like 10 years? Like, what a concept. So I got out, and then like as it did, that kind of reignited the writing bug. And I got into yoga like a week after I got it. Like a week later, I'm doing yoga, and then a year later, I'm an instructor. And I'm like, okay, this is part of my life. So
the one thing that stood out to me that you talked a lot about in that story is the monotony and the practice and just the day the same thing over and over. And I understand the importance of it, especially in the Marines, because you want to be drilled to the point where those actions are habits. But that parallels to a lot of the other things that you started to do, because that parallels a lot with yoga, I would imagine, with the monotony, the day to day. The practice is the important part, the doing over and over so that it becomes routine.
Yep.
And the same thing with writing, I would imagine. The fact that you have to, it's monotonous to get up, to write, to continue to put words on paper over and over and over again.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to know. I mean, you say it was part of the thing you didn't like about the Marines, but then you kind of choose this other path that mimics the same monotony
Well,
in a different way.
yeah, well, part of it's because like that's how I sort of trained my mind, right? I mean, that's what I was doing, and I was like, until I sort of realized, okay, I don't have to like follow my dad's footsteps. I don't have to do 31 years. I can like do something else, and that was like, oh my gosh, well, what does that look like? But it starts with like sort of recognizing where you are, and yeah, like, and I think that was the big piece for me. And you mentioned earlier, you know, like you have chapters that you've written, but like the book isn't there. Like you have to learn how to write, and that like it's not just putting stuff on paper. It's like, okay, how do I stop editing myself between what my pen is what my pen like is ready to do, and what my hesitation is, or how, like, you know, a lot of times, and that was big. The other thing, Ryan, was I started writing, especially over the course of the pandemic, by hand in a journal. And you want to talk about like blowing your mind, that is such a different experience than typing on a Mac, because like you're not deleting stuff that doesn't sound right. You're like, why did I write that? I have to reconcile that now because that just came out of me. So it was, and I think like I kept chipping away at it. 3 horror stories, 300 pages, nothing. Whiskey and Yoga, 200 autobiographical pages, nothing. 147 or whatever pages Whiskey and Yoga turned out. Okay, got it. Boom. First book, #1 bestseller, because I thought that meant something to get that out of the way for whatever reason. And then it was like, okay, now I get to learn how to write. And one of the books that I recommend to anyone is Natalie Goldberg's Writing Down the Bones, because like one of the first things she says is grab a pen and paper, grab a timer, time yourself, and don't let the pen come off the page. Just write. Don't edit yourself. Don't worry about margins. Don't worry about spelling. Don't worry about like how big you write. Just write until the timer stops. And like the first time I did it, I remember the first sentence was like, I don't know why I'm doing this. Doesn't make sense. The timer goes off. 4 pages later, I'm like, holy smokes, that's amazing. Like I just wrote for like how long, and this is what came out of me. And I was like, and it's kind of this yoga moment. I was fully present doing it because I wasn't distancing myself between what I want to say and what I'm saying.
Yeah. So I read your book, Whiskey and Yoga, and I loved it. And
Thank you.
it's interesting actually to hear your perspective going back on it. And you know, one of the things you wrote in there is success is nothing more than the little habits done repeatedly until the desired outcome is achieved. When you write something like that, and there's a ton of these like profound little nuggets in this book. I mean, what do you mean by that? I think I have an idea, but what little habits need to be done repeatedly to be successful?
Well, yeah, it's details matter. You talked about the Marine Corps and the monotony and the repetition, but like that's the whole point, is like the details matter. And the more sort of you get detailed, in a way, the military kind of teaches you presence too. And that's why like you hear people talk about combat as being so intense, because guess what? You're not thinking about anything else. You are fully engaged in that moment. And that's why people kind of get addicted to that space. I think when it comes down to like, for me, like the writing part is, it's like there's something to it, and you have to like, you know, I never thought that I would kind of take the path that I've taken with my writing, but I realized that's the point. Like I wrote a self-help book first, because the #1 thing that a book does is it helps the person writing it. And so for me, what that meant for details and habits was getting up a consistent time. I would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, but I take a cold shower for like 30 seconds, like better than coffee, wake up. I would meditate for like 15 minutes, like get my head straight. This is like just kind of be in bliss and be present. It's 4:30. I go downstairs, I grab coffee. I take 1 cup of coffee into there. Like I sit down. I may take like a few minutes to like check Gmail or whatever. And then like there's a trigger in my head and it's time to write. And so that was how I wrote Whiskey and Yoga. And then with The Lighthouse Keeper, it was, well, this is a different kind of book because it's a fiction book, even though it's meant to help people. And my understanding of the story is different. So my relationship to how I write becomes different. And so then I developed different habits to write Whiskey and Yoga, or to write The Lighthouse Keeper, because like I wanted to be writing at a different time of day than 4 o'clock in the morning. I wanted to be writing when like I would be thinking about, for me, like with so much time, like it's not so much time, but with 6 months in the ocean with the Marines, like you understand the fascination that people have being on the ocean. It's amazing. Like it's this, you cannot appreciate how insignificant like we are on the planet kind of until you see this mass of blue water all around you, and it's so beautiful. And so like I wanted to write when I would think about that. And so sometimes that was after dinner because that was like this more reflective mood for me to write The Keeper. So, and details like the way the Marine Corps is so good about that. I'll tell a quick story if you allow me, but
Yeah.
I remember listening to a Marine, he was a lieutenant general at the time, but in Vietnam, I think he was a captain. And he was on a small hill with his company of Marines, like 100 Marines, 150 Marines, and they were isolated from everybody else. They were like under siege for, I think, 90 days. And so he would talk about every day him eating his Marine shave, even when they didn't have water, like because it was July in Vietnam, not cold. And so they would shave every day. Every day they had a flagpole and they would run up a flag, the American flag. And every day they did it, the North Vietnamese would shell them with mortars. And so, but like detail matters, and you learn it's like every little thing like has to count. So you kind of start to train yourself that way. Writing the same thing and habit building the same thing. It's like, okay, let's create habits that I'm fully engaged in because I know they're going to help me accomplish what I want to accomplish. And so that comes down to how detailed do I get? How focused do I get to make this happen?
That's a great story. And I'm trying to think about the way I want to phrase this next question. But the interesting thing about that story too is the habits that they performed. One of them raising the American flag.
Yep.
I want to unpack this in a couple different ways.
Sure.
Raising the American flag, there's two different things behind this. It's one, it also defines your purpose, right? Because was it the Marines that were doing this, did you say?
Yep. Yep.
Okay. So the Marines that were raising the flag on a daily basis, they understood that by putting the flag up, they were following the direction and following the mission of the country and serving the country. And it was that defined purpose that reminded them every single day that they were there for a reason and they were fighting for a cause. So I think that's a great habit to remind yourself of a purpose. But not only that, by performing that habit, by performing raising the flag,
Yep.
it brought the reaction from the adversary to attack, and they nonetheless performed it anyway. What do you think about aligning purpose, even if it's going to bring fire?
Yeah, I would amend it a little bit because, and this isn't like, it's not, when you're in a situation like that, the reason that this captain was having his Marines raise the American flag wasn't like, as like, it was kind of a playful screw you to the North Vietnamese, but more it was a rallying cry for the 150 Marines that he had on this hill, because he couldn't be around them all the time. But he's like, you know what? This is going to be a bad situation. So we can either make it as miserable as possible, or we're going to do something to like excite ourselves every day because we don't know when the siege is going to be broken. And so it's like, raise the flag, and people are like, yes, because like everybody next to you has your back. And so it's more about like this, it's more about the camaraderie than it is about the political mission or I mean, ultimately every military action is a political action because conflict is an extension of diplomacy. But really, like it's more about there's a healthy respect. Like they got shelled every day. But the North Vietnamese are like, okay, you're gonna do this every day. And we're still like, and I mean, the North Vietnamese were doing other stuff too. They were sneaking up on the hill like at night, like getting within yards of people, like trying to get inside where the Marines were. But it's more about like, it's not about the country that sent you there. It's about 150 lives that you are, that depending on one another to get through this, that like really is the rallying cry of why those things are done. And it does,
Yeah.
I think that does speak to purpose for sure, Ryan, for, absolutely.
No. So, the one thing you talked about there too is collaboration
Yeah.
and being a part of a group and a part of like a greater, a brotherhood or a family. Um, Seeing as how you did move around a lot. I know you said you had like a best friend in Japan. I
Yep.
mean, what's your value in terms of the importance of collaboration when you're trying to be successful?
Yeah. Well, I think it's ultimately, it's huge, right? Because you start to understand like who can, where like you're not good at stuff. Like I have great, I think so, concept ideas for my covers. Like I know what I want for my covers, like Whiskey and Yoga. It's a really cool cover. I like that. The Lighthouse Keeper, like we came up with like 5 or 6 designs, but that one was the one that popped. I'm like, yes, that's it. But I'm good at the concepts. I can't take the time to put that together. Like I can't make that happen. And so it's like, I need someone. I know like I've already I went out to, I think 99 Designs is the website where you can go and just like almost say, this is what I need. And then like a bunch of different artists will give you demos. You're like, oh, I like that one. Let's do that. So you need to understand like what your strengths are. For me, ultimately, the most important thing to me is the story that I'm working on. Like that is it. I don't want to worry about like, and even now, like I've been talking to an agent for over a year on my 3rd book. I haven't talked to her like probably like 7 months because I was like, I gotta figure out what this story is first. But you realize like there are people absolutely who can help you. And the more authentically you come to them with what it is you need, the more clear you are, the more clear you can articulate that, the better value you're going to get, because it's like, oh, I can't really do that, but you should talk to this person. And so that collaboration is absolutely essential. I mean, I think certainly if you want to learn the business of publishing a book, for example, and you want to go, okay, I'm going to go find a printer and I'm going to go find a distributor and I'm going to do all this stuff. I'm going to do the work, the SKUs to get it on Amazon and all that good stuff. Great. For me, like I want to be a writer. Like I want to focus on like, what is the story that I'm going to write? And people are like, I don't care what you're doing. You have to read this. This is insane. And I can't wait to like see what he comes up with next. That's like that. Like, so that's the work. Like, okay, how do you do that? And I'm looking at, like, I have 8 journals that are next to me, probably 500 or 600 pages of stuff I've handwritten over the course of the pandemic, trying to figure out what this next book is. And then I started kind of come into it over the last week or so. I'm like, okay, because that was a lot, like a year trying to like figure something out is a lot, but now I'm kind of getting there. So yeah, it's like, you just gotta like, I mean, collaboration is huge. Like even this is collaboration. The fact that you reached out to me, I'm so grateful, so honored, because it's like, wow, it's like whatever authenticity, that I put, like where you found me, that's what sparked to bring us together. Now we've had this meaningful discussion I'm already super grateful for. And you've asked these intriguing, thoughtful questions. Like, that's like, I'm getting your message out, you're getting my message out. That's super, that's huge.
Yeah. One of the things that so I'm always a big advocate of the importance of the not the balance. What's the right word? But having your physical and your mental health align and be balanced between the two of them. I think if one is lacking, you're going to be in trouble for your overall wellness. And you write in your book, and I say that because I think that physical health is really important. You can't just say like, oh, I'm going to be successful in my career. I'm going to disregard my physical health. I'm not going to work out. I'm not going to get good sleep. I'm not going to eat right. So to underscore the importance of physical health, I think it's interesting. One of the things you wrote in the book, Whiskey and Yoga, you wrote, the equation of badassery is simple: discomfort plus duration. And I thought that was such a cool phrase when thinking about physical health. And I know that you wrote that about being in the Marines and the training for the Marines. But talk about that and talk about just health in general and wellness and how important it is to your overall success as a human.
Yeah, no, it's time to write because I've been running Spartan races for the last few years. You see the hat. And in 2018, I did my first trifecta. So if you're not familiar, Spartan races are obstacle courses, very much like what we did in the Marine Corps. And they have a 5K, a 10K, and then a half marathon. And then they have a like over a marathon, like a 50K, which is super intense. So I did my
That's
first
crazy.
trifecta, which is the 5, 10, and the half marathon in 2018. The half marathon was the last race. Training was poor for it. I ran, I think obviously it was like 13 miles. I ran 7 total, or 7 like at the most in training for it. So I didn't even get to the distance. Get there, like by mile 10, I'm completely gassed. Like my trainer has already finished the race. Like I cross, like the last part is you're going through these, cold, icy moats basically that are muddy. And then like you get to the finish line. And I remember I was so kind of defeated and I was like, oh, and then I kind of looked at Ryan. I'm like, I think I'm done. Like, I'm not doing this anymore. And then a week later, like we're working out. I'm like, Ryan, so that 50K ultra, let's do that this year. Like, and so he's like, okay. And so people are like, well, wait, weren't you just saying you hated the half marathon and now you're going to train for something that's 11 months away that's twice as hard? And I'm like, yeah, I've never done that. So, but honestly, that weighed on me. Like, cause I got 10 people to do this 50K and like, I'm the oldest person. And so there's psychology there. And then it's like, I don't, like I hate running. I got like we were training. We ran like 22 miles, I think was the longest we ran in training for it. And then we get to the race and it's November of 2019. I had just come out of a relationship, like a 4-year relationship that ended like heroically, but ended. 2019, November, right before Thanksgiving. It's raining. It's about 37 degrees. I think we started, it was like 45, but it's raining. You run the first course, and it's the first loop is 16 miles. And so like I'm a big guy. At the time, I probably weighed 200, but I think I'm down to 195 now, but I require a lot of calories. Didn't have enough calories on the first half. And so like we're getting into the halfway point and I am again, just like, oh, I'm so angry because I'm hungry. I'm like, how am I going to do this again? Like no effing way. We get in there. Like I am just like this, like thing. And my buddy's like, hey man, I'm going to go change shoes. Calm down. I'm like, and then I had some soup and it's like one of those Snickers commercials where I'm like, oh, I can do this. All right, we're good. And so like what I realized, like so we finished the race and it was like, I mean, it was just horrendous because like it was muddier the second time around. We were colder. Like my trainer was shivering. Like he's like, because all he had was a t-shirt and it's 37 degrees out. And so you just get to this place where like you kind of punish yourself to see what you can take. And then you're like, okay, I came out of that pretty good. Like, all right, like it wasn't as bad as I thought, even though at the time it was terrible. And then you're like, all right, well, I'm that strong. So what can I do now? And for writing, that's kind of what this book has been. This book has been my 50K race to be like, okay, because all this kind of crazy stuff happened. Like I went to a mastermind last year with Jack Canfield right when things started shutting down. And one of his comments to me was like, you've got a year. I was like, what does that mean? Like, what? And so like that was looped around in my head. All this other stuff started happening. This book like started pouring out of me. And then like the pandemic, the election, all this stuff. And you're like, whoa. And then like the year mark came and went without any fanfare or something. But I was like, there's this relief because like I got to this place where I guess I didn't know that I was going to get. And now I have a better sense of what the book is. So it was the same kind of thing, but that's that whole idea that like, how long are you willing to make yourself uncomfortable and how uncomfortable are you willing to get for how long? And like, when you do those things, you're like, oh, that was really hard. But when you've done it, you're like, okay, that's a formula. Like I can push myself. And yeah, sometimes it's hard and the gradient can be hard. It looks uphill, but if you don't always look ahead and just kind of look back on how far you've come, you're like, okay, I don't have to look ahead to keep going. Like I know I can just power through this.
Yeah. That 50K was a Spartan race.
It was.
So
So
there
you
was
do
obstacles the whole way too. It wasn't like you were just running a 50K.
75 obstacles. Yeah. So you do like the circuit twice. Yeah.
How long did it take you?
A grand total of, I think, almost 11 hours. I think it was 10 hours, 50
Oh
minutes.
my
Yeah,
gosh.
well, just because like they had to, and they shut like towards the end because it was part of the course was like downhill. I mean, it was like a almost like 100 yards downhill, maybe even longer than that. But like after the first 100 or so runners, like there was no grass to hold on to, and so like people, like I slid into a tree, like I slammed my shoulder into a tree, like, and they had to shut part of the course down because at night it was dark. Like they didn't expect that it would be dark by the time we finished, and then there were parts of the course that were too muddy, and so like because like after that, a friend of mine was like, well, let's do one in 2020, and I was like, I don't think I want to because like it can't be as bad as what we just did. Like that was it for me. Like cold, miserable, coming out of a relationship, so emotional stuff to deal with, and a distance I've never gone before. And then you do it, and you're like, okay, I come out like, did I, was I top, did I pedal or podium? Did I make it to a gold medal? No, I finished. Like that's all I wanted to do. I did it. So you just got to put that stuff in perspective, I
Yeah. Well, and kudos to you for finishing it. You know, that's a big accomplishment.
think. It was good. It was good. I know. And it's funny because we started out last year like gangbusters. We were like, we're going to do 25 races, and then culminating in Greece, they have a trifecta, those three same races over 3 days in Sparta. Like, who doesn't want to do that? And so, like, I had a couple of friends that were going to do that. We did 5 races by March 7th last year, and then everything shut down. Like, Greece is supposed to happen this year, supposedly. But yeah, it's a good. Like, I was telling my trainer the other day because I haven't been as active as like they're still doing races now, and I said, like I am learning to push myself, but this year, like I really want to push myself as a writer, and that's what I've been doing. That's kind of like the punishment I've put myself through over the course of the last 12 months.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you have been successful at just about everything you've tried. What's something you failed at?
Oh man, I think, I mean, it's all relative on what you look at, but I think I look at the 3 books that I tried to write. Like they were cool stories. Like there were some, it was just especially like with like how sort of elegant horror has become these days. Like when I grew up, horror wise, it was Freddy, Jason, Michael Myers, which the first couple movies were cool, and then it got okay. Let's just churn these out for a couple of years. But like now, horror, if you've seen like the movie The Witch, it's like so elegant. It's like it's terrifying. It makes you feel like you're seeing something you should be watching. It's like so good, and it's engrossing. And like I felt like I had that horror thing kind of in me, and but it wouldn't like 100 pages. And I always like I've heard people say, oh, I outlined how I wanted to do. And I did that for Whiskey and Yoga because it was self-help, and I wanted to be very methodical about it. But I didn't do it for the Lighthouse Keeper. I had this sense of how the book was going to play out. I think maybe I'd written something like just like this sort of rough sketch, of what the book was going to be and like kind of how it was going to flow. But I didn't outline. I didn't get really specific. I would just like start writing and see where the story took me. I edited it, and the editor came back and was like, this is why the story doesn't work. And so I had to do a major rewrite, but it made the story so much better. I'm like, okay, but like, that's just part of the process. You have to learn to like trust that things are going to work out. And I think that was like, I mean, that's the big writing catch for me is you almost have to write, like you almost have to write for the sake of writing. It sounds ridiculous, but you almost have to like, until you can really trust that the pen is going to say what you want it to say. Like that's kind of the simplest way. Like it's again, it's the Eastern philosophy. You and the pen are one. And until you get to that place where you're not conscious of the pen's words, sort of like what's coming out of you, like that's what every writer dreams about. Because then it's like, every great character is still a part of the writer who created them. Like Darth Vader is George Lucas in some way, shape, or form. Luke Skywalker, same thing. Like Tony Stark, take Captain America, Superman, like there's all this connection. And it's just like, how do you find, like, what do you find in you, or like as me, what do I find in me that is this uniquely David Richards take on something that may be familiar, but is like earth-shatteringly and gripping. And so that's Nirvana for a writer.
One of the things that it sounds like you have mastered is the art of the rewrite and the pivot. Um, how do you make that determination when it's time to pivot or to start a rewrite? And how has that truly helped you kind of be successful?
Yeah, well, I think it was even the process, like for Whiskey and Yoga, and I didn't have a great editing experience. Like I sent them the book, the editor had for 90 days. I got 2 proofs back, and I was so excited because I thought like I wasn't a great self-editor. I thought they would cover everything. This is like 10 days before it launched. I gave a copy to my mom to read, and she read it like in a weekend, but she's like, there's 3 misspellings and a fragment sentence. I was like, what? Whoa, wait a minute. And so I went back, like I corrected them, I sent them back, and what got released was fine, but it was like, that wasn't cool. Like I would have expected more from the editor. So then I started work. I hired a company. I started working with this company that sort of connects you to author services, like people who do book design, people who do layouts, people who do editing, people who do like public speak kind of stuff. So it was like this audience that opened up. And so I found an editor. And so I sent him The Lighthouse Keeper, and he came, like I remember we met July 4th. I want to say it was 2019, but that seems too quick. I don't know. But it was July 4th. I know that. And he's like, this is why the story doesn't work. And it was my first real editorial kind of gut check, because my initial reaction was like, how dare you? And then I was like, okay, put ego aside. Let's step back from like your thoughts and your feelings on this and be aware. And yeah, he's right. That's why the story doesn't work, because like if I go back to Star Wars, it was like Luke training with Yoda, and Yoda never relieves Luke alone kind of thing. And so like I walked away, we had a 30 or 45-minute conversation. I walked away from it and I was like, okay. And I had suggested some stuff on the call that like sprang from me, and I'm like, okay, that's what I need to do. And so I did. I like went back in, and right up until like the main protagonist is Sam, right till he gets to the lighthouse, it's pretty much the same. And then I had to make a shift because of his relationship to make the story more compelling, and I did. And so I had to rewrite like 100 pages. But you realize, one, it gives you like a chance to maybe tweak some things that you like along the way. You're like, I'd write this. Like I think there's at least one section where I'm like, I'm gonna rewrite this, and I had some inspiration or like to make it better. And I felt like, okay, I did that. And then the rest of it is, okay, let me make sure that if I've changed characters, which I did, that I've completely changed them, that there's no gaps where, oh, that's not what he is anymore. And so then it's just checking the integrity of the story. I'm like, okay, the integrity is there. It's good. And so you realize like that's the value. And so like I'll probably go back to the editor for my next book, because I had such a great experience. And like even though it's been 2 or 3 years since we've spoken, at least he has a sense, having read my book, like he'll be able to go back to it and say, okay, yeah, this is how, like, and so he'll understand how I've grown as a writer, I think, is what my sense is.
Yeah, it sounds like humility was a good aspect in
Yeah.
in opening yourself up or leaving yourself open to the necessity of change, into the necessity of a rewrite or a pivot in your mindset. Has that served you in other areas of your life too?
Yeah.
Humility?
Well, I think, oh, for sure. I mean, certainly I've come to realize that I was the problem in most of my, intimate relationships, my romantic relationships. It's like, wow, it didn't take long, but finally got there. Yay. But I also think it's back to the pivot piece. And I haven't blogged anything for almost 2 months. And my last thing was called Creating a Global Consciousness, because it was just like this inspirational thing. And I've started probably like 30 or 35. I've written about 35 pages of stuff and deleted all but I think 5, like there's 5 or 3 pages here I'm looking at. but it was just like, I would start with a good idea, and then I would get to a point where I'm like, nope. And I know enough about myself to know that when that happens, even as good as the initial feeling or sentiment might have been, that it's not fully developed yet. Because if it was fully developed, I would finish the blog. Like I would be so enthralled, and I'm not there yet. So in some sense, the editing process and like the humility of being like, okay, he's calling out what you couldn't see about yourself the way you wrote this. And that's as much a reflection on me as a storyteller as it is on like me as a human in a lot of ways. Like, okay, I didn't see like how to make the story more compelling, and now I do. And so like, I think the humility piece is just, you kind of have to divorce yourself from ego and have a beginner's mind. And that's, again, a very yogic approach to living. And so like, I've learned enough about my writing process over the course of the past year, certainly, to know when something's worth pursuing and when it's time to let it sit because the idea isn't fully baked out yet.
I like that. I like that. It's interesting because I started writing some blogs recently as well, and I found it. I've experienced the same feeling I think you're talking about, and it's so my wife is an amazing editor, and she one of her talents is putting words on paper and understanding the human language. And I would write a blog post and I would print it out and I would hand it to her, and I always kind of just cringed and I was like, uh-oh, here we go. And it was something I was so proud of, and she'd read it and she'd be like, I see where you're going, but this is not well thought out in terms of the way you structured it, or and she'd be like, I can't even edit this because it's not I like your idea, but I don't like your execution of it. And she'd give it back to me and I'd rewrite it, and I'd come back and she's like, oh, okay, now we're on target. And she, make some edits and give it back. And it was always like, I was always so proud that first draft, and I'd give it to her. I'd be like, well, here's a masterpiece. I'm sure the New Yorker's going to pick this one up.
Right.
And then, she hands it back to you and she's like, I don't think this is worth even, editing. And I was like, oh no. But through that process, I was able to make amazing strides in my writing.
Yeah.
And I was able to put out a product that was significantly better than the first draft. And it was eye-opening to me, who is someone who tends to rush into things without kind of maybe necessarily thinking about the quality, just so happy that I had it finished. So yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk about that, especially as a writer, because it was such a kind of a profound realization recently in my life.
Well, I think, and Ryan, it's funny because I was on a podcast a couple of weeks back, and it was hosted by two people, and one of the guys said, I don't write unless I know it's gonna be perfect, and all that tells me is you're not gonna write because it's so often very far from perfect, but you have to do it. You have let it be what it is, and then let someone else completely, disassociate it and say, okay, I understand what you're trying to do, but this is what's going to make this better. And so it's interesting because I think it's a lot of times you have to write to become a writer. There's not like, if you think that it's going to be perfect every time, then you're never going to put pen to paper or type on a keyboard.
Yeah. So how do you manage that balance in deadlines and quality?
Well, I mean, I think honestly, the big thing is most deadlines you only put on yourself. Like ultimately, and I say that, I think, I started writing The Lighthouse Keeper, I think in like January, maybe of 2019, knowing it wasn't going to come out until like March of 2020. So I had some time, and that was far enough. I don't even think I started agreeing to anything until I knew I had like the book done. Whiskey and Yoga is a little bit different because I think I started the process before I had it completely finished. But like you just, and even now with my writing, especially, and it's worth noting for me, Whiskey and Yoga was a very practical book to write because I could go research statistics, and I needed to research statistics or tidbits of information. And so I did that, and it was very kind of methodical, and I knew what I needed when I needed it, and how to do all that. For the Lighthouse Keeper, writing something that's fiction, it's a completely different thing. I spent like hours looking at lighthouses, looking at schematics of lighthouses, and just taking a different approach because I needed to be in a different place. And if now I'm trying to write about what it's like to be in a lighthouse at night when there's a storm and there's ocean all around you, like how does that start to feel like to as a person? How do you describe that? And so like the writing journey for those two books was very different. And because it was different, I learned there's different ways to approach things. Like there's different ways. And that's why I'm trying to even kind of take a different approach with my third book, where you're going to read it and you're like, well, I can't tell if this is fact or fiction yet. And it's like going to be in this weird zone, but that's like, ultimately that's kind of why I was going to subtitle, I'm not sure if I'm ready to say what the title is yet, but I was going to subtitle it a horror story, because depending on how you look at it, like that's kind of the scariest thing, is something that we feel could be real, but doesn't feel real, kind of like that's to me what scary is. So I wandered a little bit there. I'm sorry. I got excited.
No, that's fine. That's fine. So it's interesting to me too, because you have a goal in mind. Like when you set out to write a book, either of your books that you have published already, Whiskey and Yoga or The Lighthouse Keeper, your goal was to write and publish the book.
Yep.
How did you manage the process of like benchmarks or smaller goals to accomplish that larger goal?
It's interesting because I don't know that I really did. Like, I think for Whiskey and Yoga, I think I told myself in January that like I was going to sort of do a pulse check around tax time, April, middle of April, to see where I was. And that's what I did. And that's why I scrapped 200 pages and then reset. And I think early on, I think I was like, okay, I think the commitment was, I'm going to get up at 4:00. Like I'm doing that. Like, because otherwise, especially at 4:00, if you're not used to it, it's so easy to say, okay, 4:30, okay, 5, okay, I'll write tomorrow because I got work to do. And then you sort of push it off, and then you realize, okay, if I don't change it, tomorrow's always going to be the same. And so you kind of have to make that commitment. But I think that's where it started out. I think in terms of like, I don't know that I set deadlines in that way, because part of it is, are you, and it kind of goes back to, I was wrestling with how to mention this earlier, but like you can buy bestseller status now. Like I kind of like, and it's not necessarily inauthentic, but it's not because you've written something that's ground shaking. It's because you spent money to get mailing lists, to get stuff, exposure. And like I said, I don't know if that's right or wrong. It doesn't matter. I don't want to write for the purpose of buying a bestseller. I want to write something that like basically just goes viral. I want to write something that's like, this guy just wrote this, and like I just bought it and I can't stop reading it, and I've told all my friends. Like, and so that's the challenge you have yourself. If you say, or at least certainly over the course of the year, because like I said, Jack Canfield said I had a year, and I wrapped my arms around, okay, something's going to happen this year with this book, and it didn't. And then when it didn't, I kind of got through that really over the last week or so. It's like, oh my gosh, now I understand what the book is. Like I have this much better view of it because of this deadline that, someone that I'd never met before, who I paid to like, expose me to his wisdom. And he certainly did. Like some of the stuff he shared was groundbreaking. And even what he said about having a year without any connotation, or me not having the wherewithal to ask what he meant. But like, that was a defining moment in a lot of ways. And so it's more about, you know what, I'm going to work on this until I figure out what it is. And it's so funny because even especially with this third book, which I was going to call Being, Being, I did it through a crowdfunding campaign a year ago, February. And so like I was, and I kind of wrote this outline of the book like in early April of last year. I was like, oh my God, this is it. Like, this is the greatest thing I've ever written. It was beautiful. And then like a week later, I rewrite it because it was all handwritten, and it was almost like these two voices, almost like a text message story kind of. And I rewrote it like 3 or 4 weeks in a row. And then the story started to get like more nuanced, and I couldn't finish it. And so it became like the struggle. But meanwhile, I was telling my crowdfunding play, oh my gosh, it's done. Hey, I've got a publisher. This is gonna be so cool. And like, okay, it's not done. The publisher's like, or the editor agent's like, no, you need to work on this a little bit more. And then the summer came over and I was like, I have no idea what this is. Like I was in this sort of wasteland of what is this story? And I'm telling the people, like, I'm sorry, I know I said that I was done 3 months ago and I have no idea what this is. And so I think I wrote something like in January that said, hey, it's almost the year that Jack Canfield said, like, I do certainly have a better appreciation for the story. I'll let you know when I'll let you know what happens. And I haven't said anything since, but I'm like, I know I got to at least send something out. But the reality is, like, I feel like I just think I've got the title. And for me, that's always the first thing that I have to have. Like, I have to have the title because that is a summary of the book. And so it's like, I've had this idea for, I think, literally like 24 hours or so. I'm like, it's still with me. That's pretty good. That's longer than anything else has lasted so far in 12 months of working on something. But that's also the thing too. And Ryan, it's, you can like, I could absolutely have written something. I could absolutely have said, okay, I'm going to write a sequel to The Lighthouse Keeper because it's something I've thought about. I'm going to write a sequel and it'll be so cool. And instead of the book that I'm working on, I'll give this to the people that have like supported me with this crowdfunding campaign. But it's like if this is what it takes for me to understand what kind of writer I am or who I am as a writer, then this is where I'm going to spend my time. And if I have to fill 20 more journals of stuff over the next 5 years, then I'm going to figure out a way to do that because like I want to understand what this journey, where this journey is taking me. And it's like the last thing I'll say on it is one of the great discoveries I made in over the course of over the holidays was I was going to reread Moby Dick, but then I said, you know what, I'm going to watch the movies. So I watched the 1956 Gregory Peck movie. Orson Welles plays the preacher at the beginning. Lots of divine providence. I mean, super symbolic, a really good movie. And then I watched In the Heart of the Sea, which came out in 2015. And it's the story that inspired Herman Melville to write Moby Dick. So it's the true story of a whale somewhere off the coast of South America sinking a whaling ship by ramming it. And so you get to this really crazy place. And what you realize as a writer is we wouldn't know about Moby Dick if it weren't for Herman Melville. But we wouldn't know about Herman Melville if it weren't for Moby Dick. Like in some ways, he created the whale based on the story, but the whale also created him. And, you know, I mean, say the same thing for Ahab or, you know, Ishmael or Queequeg or whoever. But like that story defined Herman Melville for however many times that book was read in school as one of like the American classic of its age. And you realize again, the duality, but oneness, they created one another. And like, so in some ways, like the book that I've been working on and like crying over in some days, like we're creating each other. And so now I'm like, I have a much better sense of how the creation process works. So let's do this. And that again, like I'm so excited for this book. I'll tell you that I'm thinking of calling it, like I said, horror story, writing myself into existence. And that's just the title. Like,
Interesting. That's an
yeah,
interesting
so,
title.
well,
That'll be fun to see how that turns out.
yeah, I've got some ideas. Because it can kind of go very AI-ish, like, and so I'm gonna see where it goes. It's still simmering. But I'm super excited because I hit upon that I think last night at some point. I was just talking, like I had drinks with a friend, and at some point I'm like, yeah, that's it, because if you say nothing else about it, and that's the title that you see like at the airport or online, like what kind of book is that? Like what does that mean? So we'll see. I've got there's a couple other things that have popped up lately that I'm like letting simmer too, but that's been the most exciting thing that's come out of the book title search over the past 12 months.
Well, it's cool. So you're working on that book. What's the next, 10, 15 years look like? You think um, you think writing is going to be your full-time career? What are you pursuing? What do you anticipate?
Yeah, I love the written word. I mean, the written word is so powerful. And so I want to continue to explore that. At the same time, one of the early versions of Being, when I was still calling it that, I read in front of a group of friends last year. Like it was, I think, the end of April or something. And I'm like, hey, let's do this. And I had like a 30-year-old bottle of scotch. And it was so cool because I remember like it was dark. We're on this guy's back porch. And Venus, for whatever reason, like Venus was so bright in the night sky. I mean, it was almost like if you see those cards like at Christmas where it's like a diamond, like the Star of Bethlehem or whatever is a diamond. That's what Venus looked like. And we're like, what is that? And my buddy had the app with like the celestial stuff. He's like, oh, that's Venus. I was like, oh, so cool. And so I read this version of Being, and it starts out as this conversation between two voices, and one's conditional love and just this manifest idea of conditional love, and the other one's unconditional love. And so through the course of this conversation that you just like I read, but it was almost like acting because some of it like is super, super emotional. And so I kind of want to get into acting a little bit because it was this cool thing. And one of my friends was like, you should look into acting because like what you did, because I told him before and I said, okay, I'm going to read this and I'm going to get emotional, but it's okay because it's just like where the book takes me. And so like I read a certain part, like my voice started to break and like, I know it was almost, I started to cry, and then we got through it and people were like, what just happened? Like, what was that? Like, oh my God. And so, yeah, we'll see. Like, I think but certainly I say that, but it's in the guise of storytelling. Like I could almost see myself like doing readings, but like with special effects and stuff, because it would almost be like not absurd theater, but it would just be like almost magical theater, but live. And like, I mean, some of the early stuff is super cool to me. So
Yeah, have you put either of your books on Audible?
I haven't yet. It's funny you say that because I bought the microphone that I'm using to do that, and I was going to do it during the pandemic. And I think it was just because, like, when I started, Being was born, like this book idea was born coming out of that relationship in October 2019, and it was just this like mere essence of an idea. And the idea was that who we are is more important than what we do, even though there's this harmony between those two, because whatever you're doing is always constantly shaping who you are. And so like I was going to do it, and I just didn't think, like, I was going to let Being just germinate for a while. And so I thought, like, I'm doing this because I'm doing podcasts to promote the Lighthouse Keeper, but why not put both these on Audible? And I've had some people say, hey, your voice is good, you should do that. So I did it, and then like I got something to do the crowdfunding campaign, and I'm like, oh, I don't think Being's ready, but I'm going to do it. And so I did it. And so no, it's a long way of saying I haven't done that, but I probably should put that on my to-do list.
It's interesting because Audible, and I consume the majority of my books via Audible.
Okay. Yeah, I think most of us do.
Mainly because there's so much time spent where I can't physically read, whether it's driving, running, working out. But I prefer to do like a book or a podcast in those situations than music. So I think last year I may have consumed 30 plus books just via Audible.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And the fact that you're saying that you loved the acting of the book while you were reading it, I mean, it would be a great platform to open up to other people who might not know to read it, but might want to consume it by listening to it.
That's a really good idea, Ryan. And I think like it's something now that especially Lighthouse Keeper is done. Like Whiskey and Yoga, I could do that eventually, but like certainly the light. Oh, there. That was bad. Whew. Can you hear me? I just turned my video off. Do you have me back or no? Oh, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I got you.
Okay. Um, yeah, let me switch this back over. You can still hear me?
Yep.
Okay. For whatever reason, my my internet's been terrible lately. I was doing a podcast a couple nights ago, and it ended up cutting out after like 10 minutes. Just completely kicked me off. I had to restart my whole computer.
Oh, wow.
It was crazy. But yeah, I think that would be a really good. I think that'd be a really cool platform for you because you do have a great voice and you're really dynamic in the way you speak. And I would imagine, especially when you're reading your own written word, I would
Yeah.
imagine that it comes out passionately and like resonates with a listener. I truly think that'd be a really cool platform for you. I
Yeah,
do.
no, it makes so much sense too because I do like I'm a big consumer of Audible too. It just makes so much sense. It's easier, it's convenient. If you're driving somewhere, that's 30 minutes if you're working out or whatever. So it makes a ton of sense. No, I got to put that. I definitely got to put that because otherwise I'd be like, oh, let me see if I can hire someone. But I would love to like see how it would sound coming from me since I wrote the stuff. So
Don't hire someone.
yeah,
Don't do it. No, but it's just it means so much more. You're gonna
yeah,
do
I
it.
agree.
It's funny because like some people have a great voice, and like if you're doing so, I did I don't know if you've read any of the Jack Carr books, Terminal List. He was a Navy SEAL, and he wrote Terminal List, and I forget the other ones, but it was two follow ups
Okay.
to that, and he just released another one this year. He's very much like a Brad Thor kind of uh, writer.
Okay.
And when you write a suspenseful like thriller like that, it's cool to have someone like really engaging read it that can do multiple voices, and that's exciting.
Yeah.
But when you're doing like you should read Whiskey and Yoga and
Yeah.
provide context to some of the stories. And
Yeah.
look, people might go back and find some value in that book. And then, maybe get someone to read Lighthouse Keeper, or you read it yourself and act it out if you really enjoy that. And I think you'll get a really nice response by doing that. I think it's cool. And you may even learn something about the way you're writing by rereading it too. Who knows?
No, I love that, Ryan. I'm gonna take some like that's a mental note to take away because it's something I've talked about. I mean, I did the investment. I've got the speaker or the headset and the mic. I've even got the filter. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's a good call. I will hopefully you'll see something soon. So
Yeah,
appreciate that.
so the last two questions I usually like to ask, one of them might be redundant for you, but I'm gonna ask that last. So, first question is: if you could sit down for a drink with anybody in the world, past or present,
Yeah.
who would it be? What would you drink, and why?
I would go with Marcus Aurelius, and probably a nice bottle of scotch because I'm sure he's never had one. But I think it would just be, it's interesting because obviously he was, in a lot of ways, I think he's looked at as sort of almost the definitive emperor, certainly of Augustus and Julius Caesar. But Marcus Aurelius really expanded the empire and I think used military might, you know, as appropriately as possible. But he also was this super reflective and introspective man. And if you read Meditations, it's interesting because I think about a year ago, I did a podcast with this guy in Australia, and it was about Stoicism and how like this idea that Marcus Aurelius didn't like believe in the gods, like he didn't like he thought like this is all we are. I think that's a loose. I don't have that same interpretation. Like if you listen to him in Meditations, he's always talking about the gods, and so how can this man who was so supremely, smart at the time? I mean, he ran the Roman Empire, like he did it in a way that it wasn't necessarily in jeopardy. Like I don't know all of his career, but I don't remember there was any sort of rebellion or any sort of drama that gave us Julius Caesar and Brutus and things like that. But like what was his view, what did he like, how did he view the world and how did he view his accomplishments outside of just what he wrote? Because I think that'd be so interesting. And like I said, scotch, just because I cracked open, I had a 42-year-old bottle of scotch when Whiskey and Yoga went to #1 on Amazon, and it was the first time I had something that old. And the best way to describe it's almost like you just taste slow motion, like you taste time. And it's this weird, exotic feeling because it's not like you're drinking it any differently, but you can just taste the time as it kind of washes over you. And it's so, so sublime. And I'll never forget that feeling of sort of that quintessential moment. Number one on two things. Like I just had this glass. I had like a dear friend of mine had got me glasses that said whiskey and yoga. And so I was having it in a glass that said whiskey and yoga. And it was just like this beautiful, like, oh, 42 years of time in just one little drip. It was super, super cool.
That's a beautiful description of it. I love it. The last question I like to ask, that may be redundant, is because I feel like you, in a way, have written an autobiography. But if you were going to write just, your autobiography and you were going to title it your name and a subtitle, so David Richards, what would that subtitle be if you had to distill it into a subtitle?
Storyteller. Storyteller. Yeah, because that's, I think to me, what I've come to appreciate, like that's what I've always wanted to do was like, what is the grand story? Like for me, one of the constants in my life as a kid when people weren't a constant was comic books. Like I remember being at LAX on our way to Japan and waiting for like the guy who was delivering new comics to unwrap them because I saw like the book that I wanted, this Captain America book, like where he was fighting Nazis in World War II. And so that was his mainstay. And comics were always so grand. But like back then you had Super Friends, which was like these cardboard cutout cartoons. I was like, ugh. And then Superman came along and Christopher Reeve, you're like, oh, that's cool. Batman was a joke because he was like climbing up walls and dancing like in the 60s TV show. But then superhero movies started to become real. And like even I mean the technology, like to see like Lord of the Rings that's been done, like Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, like you start to see that we can visualize this grand scale of storytelling. And we've been doing that for hundreds of years. Like Tolkien wrote, generations ago. And so it's like, well, how can you do that in the modern age with all that we've accomplished and still make it feel new and fresh? And I think that's like what my writing journey has been on. But I think that's like the beauty of, I mean, where we are now, it's I was just having this conversation with someone earlier in the week, like looking at superhero movies now, it's almost impossible to tell when it's the actor and a stage, or like in a setting, like in their woods, or it's an actor with a green screen, or it's like just a computer generated version of the actor. Like if you look at some of the, like where someone's flying and you can see they're flying in a weird way, where like, okay, that's some computer generated thing that looks exactly like Henry Cavill or Tony Stark, but it's not. And like, I can't tell the difference, which is kind of cool, but it's also like, okay, well, what's the technology going to be like in 5 years? Because if we're to the point now where we can't tell, like where there's this sort of symmetry in our storytelling from a visual perspective, what does that mean for, reality kind of? And it's like, I think that's the next leap. You look at even some of the stuff like PlayStation has their VR stuff and stuff like that. If you haven't played, like if you haven't done Iron Man on PlayStation 5 with VR, it's next level. Like when you are flying and then you suddenly drop out of the sky, like everything around you is virtual. And if you drop, you're like suddenly stop. You're like, whoa, oh, I'm just holding these two things, and I had this headset on, and I felt like I just landed really hard because I let go of my repulsors too soon. So it's like, and it all goes, I know I'm wandering on this, but it all goes back to, I've started reading Ray Kurzweil's The Singularity is Near, this idea that humans at some point transcend biology. And yeah, and I think a lot of times we think it's going to be, well, we're going to put implants in our brains and take chips. And like, there's a chip, like they saw something where Elon Musk put a chip in a monkey's brain and the monkey could play Pong. Like, that's cool. But okay, what about the pineal gland? Because like the ancient Egyptians knew that the pineal gland right in the middle of our head, the third eye, is something mystical. That's why the Eye of Horus and the Eye of Ra and all that stuff exists. And they built these pyramids that we can't completely figure out how they necessarily built them today. And they built them for a specific reason. So maybe humans transcending biology doesn't have anything to do with getting an implant. Maybe it's like the spiritual or divine awakening of consciousness. So Yeah, I'm like, I've enjoyed Ryan so much talking with you that I think I don't want it to end. So I appreciate the time though.
No, no, that I've enjoyed this so much. It's been a great conversation, and I love just hearing the way your mind is working. I think you have a novel sitting in there about this blending of reality.
Yeah.
And the way you describe that, I think that's a really cool concept, just to think of how you might not know what's real and what's not real, and not in a virtual or augmented reality, but in reality itself. And what
Yeah.
happen yeah, what happens if this virtual augmented reality comes, to fruition, and there is no understanding of what is real and what isn't real.
Well, and that goes back to this idea that like we didn't invent the law of gravity, we discovered it. Like the law was there. And the same thing with the speed of light, like we've discovered stuff, but it's okay, well, how much do we know? And like I tie into, and I did an article recently about, or a couple months back, about like the relationship between yoga and quantum physics. And people are like, what? But yeah, absolutely, there's a relationship there. Like the quantum, like we know the quantum realm is real. Like we know there's a quantum level. And then I started reading stuff about muons, and I'm like, what's a muon? Like I thought the quark, like the quantum thing was the lowest thing, and now there's muons, and there's like, benign or beautiful, like other, like I've heard other names, but it's like beautiful's at the front of it. Like, so you're like, well, if you, even just from a standpoint of 160 years ago, the Pony Express, it took 10 days to get a message from the East Coast to the West Coast of the United States. Today, I can have a real-time conversation with you from New York. I'm in North Carolina. We're seeing video, a few glitches here and there, but real-time essentially. But I can do the same thing with someone in China. And maybe there's a little bit of a lag, but now we're consuming and producing information on a rate that we've never done before. And how can the fact that, big data, how is that not going to affect our decision making? Or, if we're having computers crunch numbers that would take a normal person months to do, and they can do it in a couple seconds or a couple days, like even a minute or two, and we get a result from that, yeah, that's going to raise my awareness and understanding of like how life works. Like, I work in a large IT company. Well, we've created this neural network for the earth. Like you think it's just about passing information from like, you to me, but information goes, and like nature has a say in things too. Like we live on a living planet. I mean, that's what trees and an ocean that breathes and everything else, that's kind of what this is. And yeah, so I think I think reality is going to get really interesting really soon, because more and more people are kind of waking up to this. The fact that like I remember when I first started talking about this, like it was weird that you would talk about spiritual things like in a military sense, like especially in Western culture, or like, it's sometimes still weird to people that like a guy teaches yoga. Well, why? Like I'm half, like my mom, like I came from an egg and a sperm. I didn't come from like 80% of an egg and 20% of a sperm, or vice versa. Like it was 50, like, so like I'm half female. Like we're all half male, half female. That's just how it works. Like how you genetically appear is something else. So like, it's yeah, I think we're like in an unprecedented time. I think it's going to be really exciting. I know obviously the pandemic has been this weight, but at the same time, I think, brighter days are ahead. I certainly get that sense, even though there's all these variants and stuff. But yeah, it's like it's a beautiful time to be alive. It really is.
Yeah, it's cool. I was actually listening to something the other day about reality, and it reminded me when you were talking there, because it was like, what is reality? Reality, in terms of the brain is encapsulated in your skull, right? There's no part of your brain that is exposed to the outside world. So, the crazy part about that is that your brain is what is interpreting the data that comes from the outside world. So it has no exposure to it, but it's interpreting it, and it's giving you the sensations of what you are taking in. So
Yes.
the idea that like, yeah, you and I are 1,000 miles apart right now, and with a minimal lag and some glitches, it is as if we are in the same room together having a conversation. Well, our brain, although it can wrap its head around the idea of being in a different place, in a way, it's like we are together,
Oh
because
yeah.
there's still just a fine layer of skin and bone kind of separating the brain from the outside world. but it's no different to the brain, you being on a computer screen versus you being in the room itself. And that's it's crazy to think about how that would affect reality, to say, well, what truly is real? I mean, maybe we are in the same room together, you know?
I love what you said, because in a lot of ways it's just a different eye, it's a different ear, and it's a different mouth. But like, we're still like, again, real time. Like, I'm looking at your eyes right now as opposed to looking in the camera, but like, that's all real. And so, yeah, I mean, I just think it's so interesting because like I said, I'm a huge superhero fan. So big thing, and it had an end game, which was like really, again, grand theater, to like wrap 22 movies together over the course of 10 years, really unprecedented in our time, super cool. And then there's kind of the lag, like they did Spider-Man and the pandemic hit, and like Black Widow got pushed. And then they came out this year with like their first TV show on Disney Plus, WandaVision. And it was weird because like the first couple of episodes, I was kind of like, oh crap, that's right. Like, they're still in this place where Endgame happened. And now there's this weird thing, which in a way, this is going to sound next level, but like Vision and Wanda are sort of like Adam and Eve in a way, because like he's this all powerful AI who doesn't know what it's like to be with someone else. She didn't even know she was a witch until like the end of the episode. I hate to ruin it for people, but like, and that whole universe still exists. And like, that story is part of our reality. Like, it's, you can say, well, it's fiction. It's still part of our reality. That's a real story. Like, I can go watch it right now on Netflix or on, Disney Plus or whatever. That's part of our reality. And people sometimes disassociate, well, it's fiction or it's this or it's that. Guess what? You're still experiencing it. So it's absolutely part of your reality. And yeah, it's super cool. Like, I think, and hopefully my book will certainly cover on this whenever I get completely finished it with it. But no, I think we're like entering into, I think that singularity that Ray Kurzweil talks about, I think we're pretty close to it.
Yeah, that's crazy. Well, David Richards, this has been an absolute pleasure. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you, Ryan. Oh my
yeah,
God.
Where can people find you?
DavidRichardsAuthor.com. So you can get Whiskey and Yoga and Lighthouse Keeper there. Also, other podcasts or some of all my blogs. David Richards Author on Instagram, and then I think David Richards A2 on Twitter. But please come check me out. I'm excited to like see what comes next. So this has been super exciting. Ryan, I can't believe it's almost been 2 hours. Like, this is phenomenal, because I feel like this has been so engaging. Your question's been so spot on. So thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, absolutely. Everybody, grab a bottle of scotch, open it up, and read some of his stuff. Awesome. Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Dude, that was awesome. That was great.
So good. Thank you, Ryan. I'm so glad you reached out, man. It's all like, this has been such a great journey. Tell me about you. How long have you been doing this?
Not long, like January-ish.
Because your setting is so cool though. Like, I love sort of the background with the pictures, and then you've got a great camera, and it really is strong. It's a strong presentation, man.
Thank you. Yeah. So I am, by training, my full-time career, I am a medical device sales manager.
Okay.
So I do that. I've done that for 15 years now. I do that full time. And I manage what is it now? This year, I think we're a $25 million branch of a corporation that I manage.
Okay.
So I do that, and my territory is kind of upstate New York, and I travel throughout Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Binghamton, so all of like Western New York. And I manage a sports line of implants. But I've always had a passion for podcasts. I got on very, very early. I started, back in the day of the Tim Ferriss and Adam Carolla and Joe, like way back, So I've always wanted to do something like this, and I'm a people person in that I love talking to people. I love meeting people. I love learning from people. So this format has allowed me to kind of reach out and meet really cool people and learn from them and share stories like you're telling with listeners. And it's a really fun platform for me. I've met just in the past couple months amazing people, and it's growing quickly, and I'm trying to figure out everything because it's a whole different industry,
Sure.
But yeah, my background is I am like I said, I sales manager, but I also was at 18 years old. So my kind of story is at 18 years old, I was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis, which is
Okay.
a chronic fatal lung disease. And I was told at that point that the average lifespan was 30 years. So at that point, I was kind of wrestling with the idea that I could potentially have already lived over half my life. And what was that implication going to be for my future?
Yeah.
And I took that and I refused to acknowledge that that was going to be my existence. And I went on, played baseball in college, had a
That's
phenomenal
fantastic.
career. I had an offer to play professionally, but I turned it down so that I could get married and follow like my true passion of getting married and having kids.
Hey, man.
Yeah, so did that, and then kind of over time have had my lungs decline, and this past year, right as the pandemic hit, a new medication came out, and I was at about 40% lung function, which is right around where they start talking about double lung transplant, which then gets kind of into scary water, you know?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So March of last year, I went on a new medication that almost completely reversed my lung damage and brought me
Wow.
back to the point where I was when I was 18 in high school. I'm 38 now,
Oh,
so 20,
sweet.
20 years later.
That's so
And
cool.
yeah, so I took that. I started getting better and immediately was like, one of the things I've always wanted to do is run a marathon because I felt like manifesting the struggle that I've had in like with my lungs. I was like, if I could do something physically enduring that would challenge me in that way, it would be more meaningful than anything.
Yeah.
So I've known people that have done it. So I said, you know what, I'm going to do a marathon. Well, sure enough, it's funny you said you did the 50K Spartan race because I was like, you know what, I'm just going to do an ultra marathon instead. And I signed up for a 50K and trained all last year. Ran
Yeah.
over 1,000 miles in training, and then in October, like 5 months ago, 6 months ago, whatever it is now, in the midst of COVID, with the race being canceled, I ran by myself with no aid a 50K ultra marathon in 6 hours
Wow.
and 36 minutes.
How cool is that? We should have
Yeah.
talked about that, man.
Yeah, well, look, I get to talk about it on a lot of podcasts. So,
That's
and
so
that's what I say. So
cool.
I'm writing that story.
Yeah.
But just like you're saying, I'm like, I'll write 20 pages and then I'll scrap it and be like, I don't know. Like, it just doesn't, some of it resonates, some of it doesn't. I don't know the format. I don't know how I want it to kind of turn out. I've wrestled with the fact I almost trashed the whole thing and said, I'm going to write a fiction book about it. I'm like, I don't know my direction and I've got structure. I know I want to write a book, you know? And I've done a fair amount of writing. It's just not going anywhere. And that's been my struggle with that.
Who? Yeah. So I would say, who is your audience? Like, who do you want to like? Who do you like? And what I would say was, like, I dedicated my first book to my daughter because I was like, I want her to think about like her life has purpose. There's absolutely like every one of our lives has a purpose, and you, through the course of writing and struggle and figuring stuff out, you refine that down until you, and it's not about like, oh, I can only do this, but it's about, I am absolutely clear on what I want. And so I think for you, it's like, who want to tell that story to? You want to tell the truth. Like, if your goal, your dream was to have kids, then tell the story to your kids. And like, I'm going to write to my kids, because then once you understand who you're writing for, it's going to shape what you're going to write to a great extent.
That's a really, really good piece of advice. And it's, my wife's like, she's told me, who's your audience? Who are you writing to? And my answer is always like, I don't know. Like whoever needs inspiration and motivation to get off their ass and do something with their life. And that's a struggle, because I'm like, who does need that inspiration, right? So I do understand that like a coming to age man is very oftentimes they're searching for inspiration and motivation, but they're also closed off to it. So I do feel like my message resonates oftentimes with this like 18 to 25-year-old crowd, because they've kind of gone through that growing a little bit. They're almost past that like naive on top of the world. Like once you start entering the workforce, I think you kind of acknowledge like, oh, there is a lot I don't know, and there's a lot that I need to learn. And I think that's when people start searching for something like that. But Yeah, it's that I really struggle. It's my biggest struggle is I don't truly know my audience. I really don't. So,
Well, and there's nothing wrong with it. But like, and what I would just say is like start with ideas. Like who do I think my audience is? Like it's honestly one of the things that's like I just started writing today, and literally like I said, I have 8 journals that I've handwritten stuff. I have a journal next to me that I've been writing for the past I think 6 months, like whenever days hit, and it's super intense stuff. Like it's stuff like whoa. And so I just started writing today, and really my audience is this one woman that like I saw and this is true, this is completely true. Like I saw a picture of her last April, and I'm like, I know this woman from a past life. And that's what writing myself into existence is about. And that's why it's like, well, is this real or is it fiction or is it nonfiction? It's real. Doesn't matter. It's real. And so, but like that, so I'm writing for her. Like I'm writing this, it's not necessarily to her, but I'm writing it for her. Like she's my audience that ultimately, like I want to tell the story in a way that everyone can relate to it, but it's ultimately she's the one I'm writing it for. And that kind of clarity for me is like, okay, because
yeah,
I'm dedicating the book to her. And so it's not like, I'm not saying to go that extreme, but just think about like, okay, who, like, even if you're writing for your kids, don't get caught up on, well, they're not going to buy my book, but it's that thought of like, that's what you're going to share. Like, that's what you want to share. And certainly I think the nature of what you said, if you've outlined it, I would go that path too, is maybe just take a look at it and outline it if you haven't done that already.
yeah, and that's like I said, I have outlined it. Um, I struggle with the idea of having it. I struggle with the balance of like wanting to tell my story and coming off narcissistic. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Did you struggle with that at all?
A little bit, but I think I tried to turn it on its head by like highlighting some like honest stuff. Like I think I said I've been married twice. Like that's like the first time I wrote that, that was like, but I also had like someone who was helping me write the book who's like, that shit works. Like you got to be honest. Like the more honest you are, the more real you're getting. Like if I can say, this is what happened. Like I made some terrible decisions, or like I led by my heart because there's been something that's pulling in me. That's brutal honesty. And when I'm honest with myself, then I'm going to be honest with them too. And that's what's going to pull people in, because it's not about narcissism. Like you didn't know that this was going to happen. Like you were told something at 18, and like I would imagine initially that punched you in the face. Like what
Mm-hmm.
the whoa, my life could be half over already. Are you wait? And then it's like, okay, well, how do you develop from that? Like, how do you know this flag has been planted in front of you that says you might only have 12 years left of your life? And how do you march forward? And did you do everything right? I can't imagine that you did, but it's like, here's what I learned a little about myself along the way. And that's the stuff that inspires people, because it's not about like what we accomplished. It's about what it took to accomplish it. And that's like, even
Yeah.
writing, like that's the truth. So I
Yeah.
think you're onto something.
Yeah, and I had a revelation a couple weeks ago. It was funny because my wife and I it was just like a Saturday morning sitting there drinking coffee, and the kids were playing Nintendo downstairs. And she was challenging me on it. She's like, your stuff's not interesting. It doesn't resonate. It's a story, but there's nothing that resonates with people in it. She's like, it's a good story. Like it's a good, like, this is the timeline. She's like, but there's not a powerful message that people could take away. And it was to the point where she pushed me so much. I got so frustrated. I was like, this is really what it is. And I was like, I'm a delusional optimist. Like, I don't believe if someone tells me I can't do something that it's true. And I was like, and it's because maybe it's a lack of respect for people, or maybe it's just that I don't care. I don't want to be pigeonholed into this idea. I don't believe that the doctors were correct. I didn't feel it in my heart, in my mind, in my soul that I was going to die at 30 years old. And I refused to accept that as my reality. And I understood that I was going to be successful no matter what. And then I was like, you know what, Lisa? I said, when I wanted to become a medical sales rep, I took one job interview, and it was a personality test, and I thought I crushed it. And they said, you know what? You don't have the personality to work for this company. And it was a major company. And I said, you know what? You can go F yourself. I'm going to get a job with your competitor and take all your business. And I went and did that. And I was like, this has manifested itself in my life so many times. And I think this mindset is powerful. So I went through this whole thing. And she was like, I think you just wrote your book.
I think you do, because that's what it is. Like, I'm not going to allow other people's expectations or limitations box me in. And that's super powerful, right? Because if you otherwise, it'd be like, fuck, I got 12 years of my life left. Well, okay. And then you're on this, like, you set this collision course for 30, and because that's what you believe, that's what you're going to manifest. So I think that's exactly it. You are the captain of your own ship. I mean, that's your story, Ryan. And it's like, this is the mindset that I had to accomplish this. Like, because anybody, like, I remember when I was 18, if someone told me that at 18, I'd been like,
celebrate the start of the weekend with your Alexa routine.
Alexa, pause.
You have a good one.
She's listening. AI.
I know. So
so that's kind of the direction I'm going in now. And it's a good direction, and I like it. And I've gone on some tangents writing with it. It's more or less now capturing the structure that I want to roll with, but also, like, it's hard because I want people to read the book, and I want it to be good, and I want it to have some actionable things, but it's trying to find the balance of, preaching how to have this mindset, or how it's affected me, and just kind of finding that balance of what that should look like in the form of the written language, I think. So.
No, that's super exciting. Well, if I can help you in any way, because I really appreciate, like I said, this is I love this. I haven't had a podcast. I feel like it's at least been a couple of weeks, but really, I thought your questions were really insightful. I could tell, like, you asked stuff that, like, because my story is the same, but you asked things that had me approach things differently, which I thought was super cool, because that it just makes me appreciate, like, the quality of the work that you put into this. So I can see, like, I'd love to read your book when you come out with it, man. So. Oh,
well, thank you. I appreciate it. And look, thank you for taking your time. And like I said, I loved your book. I love whiskey. So I was like, whiskey and yoga? Hell yeah. I'm a bourbon guy. I don't like scotch. But I was like, hell yeah, I'm going to read about bourbon and or whiskey and yoga. That sounds awesome. And then honestly, I was surprised how it wasn't that, like, the prism that you wrote it through was a cool platform, or not platform, but it was like a nice prism through those two things. But I love, like, that self-improvement type of genre as well, which is why I've kind of wanted to write that, and the way the podcast kind of has manifested itself. But yeah, I loved the book, and I'm definitely going to get The Lighthouse Keeper to read as well. I'm not as big of a fiction fan, but I liked your writing enough to be like, I'm gonna dive into this genre too.
Oh no, so. I appreciate it. Well, and it's interesting too, because, like, at the end of every chapter, like, because I wanted to make it self-help too, and so at the end of the chapter, like, the main character kind of writes a summary of, like, things that he thought about in his journal in terms of mastering your mind. So no, it's super cool. No, I appreciate that. I appreciate the words. Let me know when this airs, because I want to make sure that I promote it. Yeah. I'll get it on my website too. But Ryan, absolute pleasure. I enjoyed this, and when the next book comes out, I'd love to do it again.
Absolutely. Probably 4 to 5 weeks out. So okay. I'll keep you posted. And then yeah, this was awesome, David. Thank you so much, man. It was really great talking to you and get to know you.
Likewise, Ryan. Have a great weekend.
Awesome. You too.